I've always now been aware of the power of myth, as Joseph Gab, of stories, and how at any level, whether they're anecdotes between two people, your family stories about your local football team, your community, whether they're folklore, fairy tales, religious stories, all of those are basically timeless, and they are in all cultures. We're hardwired for them.
Prepare your ears, humans. Happy, Sad, Confused begins now.
I'm Josh Horowitz, and today on Happy, Sad, Confused, George Miller is back. It is his third time on the podcast. I'm privileged to say, if anybody watches or listens to this podcast, they know my favorite topic the last 9 years has been Fury Road. Well, George has done it again with Furiosa. It is my new obsession. I am so thrilled to have him back on the podcast. Welcome, sir.
Thanks, Josh. Thank
it's
you.
good to see you. Congratulations. First of all, look, I want to set up a little bit of the background, the storyline of how this came to be. For those that don't know, this is a very unusual circumstance. This was born out of Fury Road, and I guess the backstory that you felt was important to outline for your characters. Two stories came out of it: a Wasteland story for Max, and this script.
Yes.
And correct me if I'm wrong, this was originally going to be an anime film way back when.
Yes.
So how much does this resemble what that was going to be?
Well, it was pretty close, actually. Surprising. The essential structure of it was pretty much the same. Obviously, things changed, and there were embellishments and amplifications, I suppose. But in order to tell Fury Road, there's no way we could do something that was on the run when all the exposition had to be, as I say, on the run, and yet you had to somehow it had to have the world and the characters and every bit of design had to have a very coherent internal logic. So we had to write the story of Furiosa. We had to write the story of Max. And in the process, define everything we see in this world. We had to understand how the Wasteland worked. And we thought, this would be great. If we make Fury Road, we can release soon after an anime. And we did that, but as you know, Fury Road kept on being delayed.
Yep.
There's no point in making an anime before, but it was very, very useful to have this screenplay and show it to the cast and crew. Before we started to shoot, and here we are all these years later, and we've just finished this one.
Just a mere few thousand people working on a film, and 10 years later, here we are. Talk to me a little bit about, and there are going to be some light spoilers for this. We're releasing this after the film has been out, so you've been warned. But it strikes me that this is a film about the first line of the film is something to the effect of "No one knows what is true anymore." And you've been dancing with this throughout the Max series of myth, of the power of myth.
Yes.
Max at times, there is talk of what was true and what wasn't true, but the legend of Max, and that leads all the way to the end of this story of the many different ways maybe Dementus met his fate and what is true and what is not. I guess I'm curious, what the power of myth is to you, myth versus truth in a story like this.
Well, I think every story worth its salt, even let's say documentaries, have an allegorical element to them.
Right.
And I find myself really drawn to allegory. I wasn't even aware of it for most of the time, but way back with the first Mad Maxes, they were recognised, particularly by the French critics. They said, they're westerns on wheels. And that suddenly made a lot of sense to me because like the westerns is about elemental worlds where the rules of engagement are much more simple. You're able to sort of understand maybe make the stories less cluttered so that so the stories are less cluttered, and you can somehow glean some sort of resonances and meaning from them.
Right.
No different from, say, a Happy Feet movie or a Babe movie.
Sure.
So that's the big thing that attracted me to doing these movies.
And in terms of, it's funny because like I also see this recurring theme throughout your films, and like I actually, of all films, I watched a little bit of Lorenzo's Oil last night, which I've always appreciated. And it's a film, if you'll grant me this kind of indulgence, a film about how we are tested and what we do when we are tested. Do we accept the fate that has been kind of given to us, or do we make our own fate? And to me, that's kind of what this film is about too. This is about how Dementus decides to react in this extreme circumstance, and how Furiosa applies herself. Is that something that you feel is? I would imagine this is something that's maybe born out of your own background in medicine and seeing how people react under duress.
Yes.
Is that fair to say?
There's no question about that, Josh. In fact, I think that's how life happens.
Yeah.
One way or another, to some degree or another, life is always throwing up obstacles or problems or whatever. For some, it couldn't be more extreme. For others, it might be minor things. But it's still, we are forged by those sort of random contradictions of life. As John Lennon best said it,
right.
Life is what happens when you're making other plans. No question. And so that's definitely that's definitely the case with all these stories.
Yeah.
But particularly a film like Furiosa's story in this one, she gets taken, put in an extreme situation. It basically all the trials and tribulations and the conflicts she endures and somehow survives. It reveals more and more about her until we get to some essence about the character. I think that's an essential thing out of all stories, every fairy tale,
right?
Every myth, every almost, let's say, religious stories. So anyway, that's what. I think that's why I'm still drawn to make films like this.
Well, it's funny. It's like, and I think of someone. I think of someone like James Cameron, who in the last like decade plus of his life has decided that the Avatar world is where he can put all the ideas that consume him. And in a similar way, it seems like you found this bucket, like you found this world where like you can deal with every aspect of life in the Mad Max world, in the Wasteland.
Yes, I'm without actually thinking of that as a strategy. It's what I've realized that's happening. They're very. You can tell look, a story is in the eye ultimately of the beholder.
Sure.
We all apprehend the stories according to our own worldview, and I think these sort of stories are. I think the important thing is that the meanings. I know what virtually everything means to me in this story. I have to, and I know what it means to each of the actors who play certain characters.
Sure,
but we're offering it up. We're inviting the audience into the experience, and they're there to make of it what they will.
Right.
And I've been astonished by if the narrative can breathe enough, if it's not closed enough, how wonderfully different interpretations of certain things are. And I can give plenty of examples of that, but I won't right now. I won't take up the time.
Well, no,
that's an exciting thing to me.
Of course.
And even in this process now, we only finished the film about 3 weeks ago, and I've now been on this press tour in many countries, and in Asia, South America, in the United States, Australia, and Europe. And it's really interesting how the film and the story is reflected back at we who made it. I find that one of the most exciting things about the process.
I find there's a bit of an irony to the fact that like after the last two films, which are the first films that have dealt with the Furiosa character, we know way more about Furiosa's story than Max's story at this point. Have you like ever gone back and outlined Max's past in a specific way in terms of what actually happened, how society fell, in the way that you have outlined or now scripted Furiosa's story?
Well, in order to tell the story of Mad Max Fury Road, we had to know what happened to Max, at least in the year before we encounter him at Fury Road. And if you look at Fury Road, there are little flashbacks.
Right.
And he's somehow carrying a lot of trauma with him. So we have to know that story. But not only for those characters, in order to make something that is pretty a world that's pretty flamboyant, and keep it consistent and real, so it's not just randomly designed. We had to know that about everything and everybody, every gesture, every utterance, and even the doof warrior.
Right.
The big thing. We really had to know, because how could a guy who's blind and all he can do is play a guitar, how can he survive the Wasteland?
Right.
And we have a story for how that may have happened, only so that the Iota, the actor playing him, had some idea of who he was. He's just not appearing. And so that had to happen with everything in the story.
So if that happened on Fury Road, did something similar happen on this? Did this story spark any elaborations? Like, is there a Dementus backstory?
There is. I had to do it. In fact, when we were doing the anime, Mahiro Maeda, the great Japanese anime artist, he did some concept art, and he drew Dementus, a different looking Dementus than we see Chris Hemsworth play. But he did a Dementus, but he had a teddy bear hooked onto his costume. And that grew into the narrative of the teddy bear. And he refers to the teddy bear belonging to his own children. Yeah. So we had to go back and figure out Dementus' story just to understand how he speaks in that way, why he has that sense of showman pageantry. He's one of those flamboyant characters that are kind of variations on a theme that we see right throughout history. Even today, part of their charisma and bringing people together is quite different than, say, Immortan Joe, who's another warlord. And we had to know how that all happened.
So what was his occupation? What was he in the real world?
Well, I'm not going to say. I know who his father was and his parents were. Praetorian Jack refers to his parents. My mother and father were warriors. I know where, or we know where Dementus, what happened to his father 45 years earlier, at the moment when the world fell.
Right.
All of that. I mean, I won't say too much, because it'd be interesting to see what people. People carry their histories.
Right, they'll
with
bring
them.
their own.
They'll bring their own.
Do you imagine? Look, there's only so much time in the world, and I know the Wasteland film might happen at some point. Do you imagine exploring any of these other stories in any other form?
Oh, I liked. Anime is great.
Yeah.
Comic books are great. It's just a question. If I'm lucky enough to do some of them, they're fine. But I've got some other films, non-Mad Max films, I would love to do before I can no longer do them.
You mentioned Praetorian Jack. This was one of the great surprises of the film for me, was Tom Burke in this film. He's so wonderful in this. And you can't look at that character and see that character without, he's not Max, but there is some elements of Max there. Yeah. And what I find curious is, I haven't watched Fury Road again, but I'm trying to imagine now, does the Furiosa we see in Fury Road, when she sees Max, almost recognize, oh, this reminds me of a man I once knew. This reminds me of Jack.
Until I saw the film and people, until people who saw the film came back and, like you said, he reminds them of Max, it never didn't occur to me.
Oh, really?
Now, but this is the sort of thing but the moment it was said, I thought, of course he does. Yeah, of course he is. Yeah. Very, very, very similar. the Venn diagram overlaps a little bit, but again, it just arose out of the work. I'm happy to say if I went back and saw Fury Road, if I saw Furiosa butts directly into Fury Road, so you can watch the two films as one extended, 4-hour movie. If the moment when Furiosa in Fury Road sees Max, and they and there is a couple of moments of interaction where they finally come together, the audience might put that together saying, oh, this is familiar, I've been here to some extent before, particularly when Max is talking about, joining together rather reluctantly, but realizing they have no choice, and they basically have some regard for each other. So again, these are the sort of things that come out of these stories.
No, it's delicious.
That I never expected.
Yeah, totally. There are some stories about my uncle's life, one particular uncle's life, that I find truly always funny and heartfelt and wonderful. I never get tired of hearing them. From hilarious to heartfelt, tear-jerking to plot twisting, his retelling of the events of his life always brings me joy. And just in time for Father's Day, I found the perfect gift that captures all his stories for my family forever. It's called Storyworth. Storyworth helps you preserve precious memories and stories from your father or your grandfather's life for years to come. Here's how it works. This is so cool. Each week, Storyworth emails your loved one a thought-provoking question that you get to help pick. There are dozens upon dozens of cool questions. Their favorite teacher growing up, their favorite movie growing up, their TV show, all of these spawn these great answers, and Storyworth makes the writing process a breeze. All your loved one needs to do is respond to that email with a story. It can be long or short, it really doesn't matter. You'll be emailed a copy of your loved one's response as they're submitted over the course of the year. You'll get to enjoy their retelling of the stories you already know, or be surprised by stories you've never heard before. After that year of fun, Storyworth compiles your loved one's stories and photos into a beautiful keepsake hardcover book that you'll be able to share and revisit for generations to come. You could even keep a copy of the book for yourself. This, for me, is going to be a perennial. Every year, if not multiple times a year, I'm going to come back to this book and I'm going to share it with my family and the next generation. Families love Storyworth. That's why it has more than 25,000 5-star reviews on Trustpilot, with millions of stories preserved since they were founded over 10 years ago. Give all the fathers in your life a unique, heartfelt gift you'll all cherish for years. Storyworth. And right now, you can save $10 on your first purchase when you go to storyworth.com/happysad. That's storyworth.com/happysad to save $10 on your first purchase. I want to talk a little bit more about casting. I mentioned Tom Burke, but look, it was a tall order to cast a new Furiosa. Anya is fantastic in this, and I know Edgar Wright was involved in kind of like recommending her. I'm curious though, like there are so many stories about casting Tom Hardy as Max, and we know a lot of the names that were associated. For casting Furiosa, and this was in the pandemic time, so it sounds like you didn't even get to meet with people in person. Correct me if I'm wrong. Did you do a lot of like Zoom? Like how many Furiosas did you meet with?
To be honest, we did some, but it was just exploratory, and it was just before, literally, I was finishing up. I was in Turkey finishing up casting on 3,000 Years of Longing. I was in London, and it was just as the pandemic, if you like, was announced.
Right.
In fact, and Edgar had just shown me a fine cut of Last Night in Soho.
He says this was like the dinner right before everything closed down.
We did, and if I remember, properly, he had a bit of kind of a flu, and I had a bit of a flu, and we thought, oh, gee, is it? We got this thing. As it turned out, we didn't. Oh but however, he showed me the movie, and I saw Anya, and I had never seen. I'd seen clips of The Witch, but I hadn't seen her. And somehow I had this very strong, response to what she did, as so many people did. There's something just very powerful. She's a very powerful presence, and then he basically told me that how she's her level of skill. He said he didn't even know I was thinking about Furiosa, but he just said, if you're thinking of casting her, do it. She's got everything. She can do it all.
Yeah.
And that proved to be the case. But so I didn't, it's really, really weird. I didn't meet with anybody else. I did speak, and we talked about it, but I had no idea.
Yeah.
Very similar thing happened with Tom Burke. When we finally we had Anya, and we were sort of and Chris,
Right.
And I remember Nikki Barrett, the casting agent, made a list. I think there are about 20 people on the list, as people do, and I think Tom's name was third or fourth on that list, and it was really stark. I got to his name, and the moment I saw it, never thought of it, but the moment I saw Nikki's suggestion, I didn't read the rest of the names.
Wow.
Because
sometimes you just know. Yeah.
I just knew, because
Yeah.
I'd seen. I was struck by his work in the souvenir.
Yep.
And then I think by then Mank had come out.
Right.
And I thought, God, this guy is just, there's just something about him. And again, and you always go, look, I've spoken to a lot of directors, and so many of them say, I know the first 2 seconds they walk in the door, and it's true. There's something about who they are, the characters are theoretically in your mind, and the presence, that immediate sort of first impression that you get in, and then it's just a question of confirming that impression and reinforcing it, not only right through the auditioning process, but the rehearsal process and then the shooting process, and then you see what comes out the other end, and then you sort of thank the movie gods that it all worked.
There was talk, like the only other actor that I heard reports about was Jodie Comer, who I have a lot of admiration for.
Yeah.
Was she somebody that you at least spoke with?
I think we spoke to her.
Yeah.
But I don't. I think that was quite a bit before the movie hadn't. I was still in the preparing to do 3,000 Years of Longing. We hadn't had a date, and that fell apart. But it was really when it got serious. We had to. That finally we got to. I saw Anya. Yeah.
There is a glimpse in the film of Max. Max is in the film, kind of witnessing the events from afar for a moment. Was there ever consideration of using Tom? Did you ever see if Tom could make the trip to do that cameo?
No, because we had just in terms of the logistics of it. Again, we were shooting during COVID, and Jacob Tamori, who is a wonderful stuntman from New Zealand, did so much work, brilliant work, with Tom, and I think subsequently has worked with Tom quite a bit. He was doing, he did some other stunt sequences in the movie, and I thought, oh, he's here, and he certainly knows the character, and he certainly looks the part, and for the shot he worked. No, but we didn't think in terms of Tom.
Well, one thing I find fascinating is kind of what you decide to show and not show in this film. So, for instance, towards the end of the film, you kind of gloss over a 40-day war that could have been a film in and of itself, I would imagine. Another example is, I don't know if correct me if I'm wrong, I've seen the film twice. I don't think we ever see Jack actually die. I don't think we actually see Praetorian Jack. I don't think we see literally what happens to Furiosa's mother. It's inferred. But can you talk a little bit about the choice of what to show and what not to show?
Well, you need to show it virtually from the point of view of the character.
Right.
Particularly to tell something that, a saga over 18 years. You can't digress too much. It has to somehow be somehow tangentially involving the main character in some way. Otherwise you can lose track. It's not like a novel.
Can't change perspectives, especially with something like this, where it is so Furiosa's story.
It has to be.
Yeah.
So for instance, the war. All stories of war involve so many people. But the stories that somehow, I remember there was a war. I think there's a war in Europe, and I remember there was a couple. There was a story that stuck in my mind of a couple who was shot, though each a male and female who had fallen in love in their village, and they were trying to make their way away, to get away from the theatre of war. And they died on a bridge together. It always struck me. And you hear stories, over and over again. I hear family narratives of people I know who went through the 20th century and the several wars, and they always talk about how their family got out. Right. It's always those individual stories that somehow at the center of it are really the way we access the larger story of the war, the dynamics and the logistics of the war. So sure, that war might have been interesting, but Furiosa wasn't involved in it. She only observed it from afar. She helped Immortan Joe side by revealing Dementus's plan. She says he's not going to Gastown. Meantime, she has to recover. So we had to stick with her. And then, and so that's one thing. In terms of the death of Praetorian Jack, it's implied, as is the mother's, sure. But we're not there so long as the audience knows that happens, we're not there to kind of make a little documentary about the death of Mary Jabassa or Praetorian Jack. Again, it's our perspective is always got to be with Furiosa.
So you mentioned Immortan Joe, and I find it fascinating. Like suddenly he is the lesser of two evils in the film like this, and we kind of alluded to this in one of our past conversations about sort of like, that Immortan wasn't necessarily the evil that we knew in Fury Road at a certain time, and this is the nature of power and power corrupting. Yeah. And you talked about this with me about Furiosa herself, about what happens to her afterwards. Yeah, exactly. Does she get corrupted or not? Yeah. So, I mean, that's a fun thing to play with in a film like this, to play with our expectations of who Immortan was, because we're seeing him in kind of an interim period between, like, do you imagine, again, his backstory being even further on kind of the side of like being a rational man, a good man, as opposed to the monster he became?
Well, his backstory is again, like most of them, people. He actually was there during the cascade of catastrophes that basically led to the apocalypse. Right. Whatever they are, whether they're, as they say, a nuclear skirmish, if there could ever be such a thing,
just a small skirmish,
or a water war, or oil war, or catastrophic climate change where everything all happens at once. He was there before, like the history man, and he says, for him, initially he was Colonel Joe Moore, and then he gets out into the wasteland. He becomes this sort of a deified in some way, or at least uses some sort of religious belief to become what's him. But again, I always struck by most stories throughout history about how if the hero is the agent of change, and it's often said that yesterday's hero becomes today's tyrant. They become so holdfast, as Joseph Campbell said. They hold on. They love what they built so much that they become rigid and whatever. And so someone else has to rise to basically break down those sort of orthodoxies. I mean, that's a constant pattern in history.
So do you still believe, though, you hesitated, though, on our last conversation about charting Furiosa's path afterwards. You didn't think necessarily she would fall prey to that pattern. Do you still subscribe to that?
In my mind, that's usually what happens. But in her, I think she's been through too much.
Right.
And I think she would carry the residual. She hasn't fallen totally into despair. She would carry something of what she had as a child, the way she grew up in the green place, which is not utopian. I mean, notice the Vavellini, they have there's they're subject to moral injury as well. They have to kill everybody who might. No man and no one shall live to tell of this place. Right. Otherwise, that place is dead.
Right.
It only survives because of its isolation. So it's one thing to say, oh, we've got this lovely green place of many mothers, but to protect it,
you have to be brutal. You have to
be brutal,
yeah.
And I guess that's the moral dilemma that, in one way, to small degrees or large, we all face in some way.
Are there other versions of this film? Obviously, Fury Road, you did the Chrome version. Will you do that for this? Is there an extended cut of this? You have it. It's ready.
It's the last thing I did on this film, and I call it tinted black and chrome. Or I want to call it tinted black and chrome. And I must say, it's really interesting. There's something I'm still trying to demystify why the black and white, for me, has something more elemental to it. I still can't quite put my finger on it. It's not because they look like old black and white movies. It's something else. So it's like if we took a picture of ourselves right now, it might be a little bit more dramatic if it was black and white. I think, yeah.
And I know it's premature to talk about this other film, but there is. So correct me if I'm wrong, because I've heard different things. I know this Wasteland story is out there, but are there 2 more Max stories that you have kind of written out?
No, only one.
Only one.
Yeah.
And it began as a novella, but it is now a script.
No, it's still a novella, and we've been working on a script for it.
And premature, I get it.
Yeah.
But the basics, it's the year before, and from what I gather, it concerns Max and a young mother and a journey that they go through.
More or less, yeah. With these things, I really don't like talking about it.
Fair enough.
I've been through so many movies that that you want to make. You've got almost within a couple.
Literally,
of
the camera's up and ready, and the actor's there.
Yeah. And it's true. I found that a lot. It's better not to talk about it.
Would you even say like what it's analogous to in terms of form, whether it's more of a chase film or an epic of this size, of what it would feel like?
I'd say it certainly has a lot of action in it, but it is also a saga. It's a year-long story. I mean, Fury Road happened over I don't know, in 3 days and 2 nights.
Right.
I don't know how many hours that is, but you could almost say that the first act, some part of the second act, and the third act mostly play in real time.
Right.
So it's quite a different kettle of fish than say Furiosa. And with the Wasteland, I'm still figuring out what to do with it, but I'm just simply waiting to see the reception on Furiosa, and if it all lines up, we'll go ahead with it.
You mentioned kind of like, this dance with other films that almost happened. And I don't know if we ever have talked about the Justice League film. It's one of those like unrealized projects that will always be a fascination for me to see what George Miller's Justice League would have been. What was your, in a nutshell, what was your fascination and excitement about taking on those characters?
Basically, I'm driven by curiosity. The thing that sustains my curiosity is not only trying to figure out how to tell stories, but why we tell them.
Right.
And of course, one of the significant thinkers that basically shone light on storytelling for me was Joseph Campbell.
Sure.
But I had no idea after we made it why the first Mad Max seemed to have a lot of resonance around the world until I read Joseph Campbell after the event. And then that led to Mad Max 2 and so on. And here I am still sort of doing it. So Justice League, I've always been interested in that. I've always now been aware of the power of myth, as Joseph Campbell, of stories, and how at any level, whether they're anecdotes between two people, your family stories about your local football team, your community, whether they're folklore, fairy tales, religious stories, all of those are basically timeless, and they are in all cultures. We're hardwired for them. And of course, the great attraction of the Justice League is that their roots go way back to the Greeks and the North, but particularly the Greeks. And then and I'm so acutely aware of that sort of force in the world. And I feel particularly privileged to grow up in Australia, where we have the oldest continuous culture on the planet in the Indigenous Australian narratives, at least 65,000 years old. Yeah. And the more I get to know them, the more remarkable they are. And without going into a long story, Fury Road was about 5 wives being taken away from the Immortan Joe. And it was only after Fury Road that I remember that one of the base story, one of the founding stories in all the narratives, the so-called songlines of the nomadic indigenous culture that can go back all that time, was a story of 7 sisters escaping a malevolent male force. And they, in their travels across the wasteland, they explained everything.
Right.
Everything, every watering hole, every nook and cranny, every rock, every hill, and indeed the stars. And I thought, wait a minute, this is a continuum.
These stories are so in our bones that you can't.
In our bones, we are hardwired.
Yeah.
That's why cinema, despite all the prognostication that cinema, I think, will stay.
Yeah.
Simply because we need that shared experience somehow.
And it's in a way like, the callous way of talking about why we keep seeing reboots of Superman and Batman is money, but it's also because those stories have power, those myths, they are the modern myths.
They are, without question. And they're completely being reworked and recycled and reinterpreted according to the times.
Right.
They basically have new meaning in the zeitgeist. That's been the progression of stories throughout time. That's the thing that really blows me away. And I think, that's why I'm attracted to them so much. Yeah.
A couple other things, and I'll let you go. You've been very generous with your time, as always. I saw you with Hideo Kojima briefly, and I know you're in the new Death Stranding game. He's a great admirer of yours.
Yes.
And one thing I love about you and someone like James Cameron is, like, you adapt. You move. Storytelling is changing. Filmmaking is changing. We're still in its infancy. But I'm curious, like, are you excited by AR and VR and gaming and exploring all of those facets when it comes to storytelling in the future?
Excited and fascinated to see where it goes. To see because it's always changing. If you trace, cinema is only 130 years old.
Right.
A brand new language. Which we learn from when we're little, even now before we learn our own language. But it's always changing and in an ever-accelerating way. So the difference between the digital dispensation and when we worked on celluloid and analog is huge. The difference between shooting Furiosa 9 years after we shot Fury Road is significant.
Yeah.
So we were able to do things we couldn't even think of back then, and it will continue to change. And now you have all these new technologies, waiting in the wings and being used, and it will change, and different ways of viewing and different tools. And I'm excited by all of them. You just never know where it's going to lead. However, there's always the constant.
Right.
The basic process is always going to stay the same. I'll never forget being in drive-ins. Not many people go to drive-ins now, but I'll never forget going to drive-ins, and whenever the audience was excited by something, the way they showed their excitement, they couldn't yell out the window or anything. They flashed their headlights on and off, and the screen would suddenly go white. And you knew everyone else in there. They couldn't honk their horns because either you couldn't hear the dialogue. But the scene. And again, it has to be a shared experience.
Yeah.
That I think will always be there in some way.
Have you ever considered doing a actual silent film, a film with no dialogue? Because it's always this talk, and I don't know why people are surprised with every Max film. Like they always say, oh, she has 30 lines of dialogue. If you go back to any of the films, your protagonist always has about that amount to say. It's not a far cry, I would think, to go completely without dialogue in a George Miller Max film.
I'd never thought of it, but only because I think they are kind of silent movies, meaning they're silent movies with sound.
Right.
And you make. I remember I used to, when I first started, was interested in making films. I used to watch movies where I'd turn the sound off on the television, and just to see how much. How they'd work. I always remembered back then that Hitchcock quote where he said, "I try to make movies where I don't have to read the subtitle in Japan." However, it's also interesting to me what you can do with sound.
Right.
And I remember a startling moment when I met a critic. I don't know if I told you about it. I met this critic who told me that he wrote film reviews for the Royal Blind Society. And I said, "What, you mean blind people go to see movies?" He said, "Of course they do. They don't see them, they listen to them." And I suddenly thought, yes, you can really get a lot of story from sound. In fact, you see with your ears in many cases. There are moments in this movie, and it should be in every movie, where the audience actually does that.
Yeah.
And so now those two things working synergistically, sound and the sound and the vision, allows the experience to be more immersive, I think. But I never thought of making a silent movie, because I think most movies, should be seen as, see if they can be read as silent movies first, and then you see what you've got, and then you add the sound and so on.
Kind of why I love Dementus, because he is so contrary to so many of your characters in these films.
Yeah.
I mean, you end this film with perhaps the most dialogue-driven sequence of a Max film ever.
Yeah.
And it is, for all the bombast and the car wrecks, it's two human beings just interacting.
Yes,
in a Max film, which is fantastic.
Yes. Well, he being a showman uses words just like Immortan Joe when he makes those big pronouncements. I am your redeemer and all that sort of thing. The words are part of the pageantry.
Right.
But someone like a Max or a Furiosa, or a lot of those classic characters that we saw in the westerns, they were utterly laconic, because they had no need for words. And
So I'll end on this. There's so much doom and gloom talked about in cinema, but this is why I love talking to you, because you're such an inspiration both in your words and the films you make. And there are some great, in recent years, some spectacles like the Max films that have really inspired folks like me and any movie lover, whether it's Top Gun and it's James Cameron, it's the John Wick films. I mean, what has excited you as someone that loves film in recent years? Have you been inspired by any filmmakers or specific films?
Well, I am. Believe it or not, this is going to say, coming over on the plane here, I watched some extended South Park.
Not what I was expecting.
I thought they were fantastic. I mean, that's really high end storytelling to me. There was one on COVID. I don't know if you've seen.
I haven't seen it. I'm a little
really
behind on it.
The extended. That's great storytelling. But there are lots and lots of movies, and it's that and bits of movies. Sometimes it's just a passage of a movie,
right?
Or sometimes it's one shot,
right?
But to list them all. I'm still incredibly excited by cinema, because again, it's evolving.
Yep.
It's always changing. We're reading movies in differently now. We're speed reading them. We're bringing a lot to each story. It's not just a brand new. We're bringing a lot as an audience.
Yeah.
And there's a kind of a cultural evolution that's happening in front of our eyes. sometimes scary, sometimes hard to get hold of, but it's happening, and that's one of the excitements of it.
Again, it's always a privilege to catch up with you, sir. I think you know this, but I mean, our last talk, I got a lot of filmmakers to send in questions. You know how revered you are by others, and this film again is going to inspire so much conversation and interpretation for years to come. So hopefully, it won't be so long before I see you again soon.
All right, John.
Congratulations.
But don't
again.
call me sir. I sound like a school teacher.
No.
Yeah.
George, always a pleasure.
Yeah, please, George.
Thank you again.
Thank you. Thanks, Josh. Thank you.
And so ends another edition of Happy, Sad, Confused. Remember to review, rate, and subscribe to this show on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. I'm a big podcast person. I'm Daisy Ridley, and I definitely wasn't pressured to do this by Josh.